Silphium was stored in the Roman treasury alongside gold and silver, classified as a strategic reserve equivalent to precious metal. Roman supply ledgers listed the resin at 12 denarii per pound, a price that made it worth, ounce for ounce, more than prime silver. The city of Cyrene, on the North African coast of what is now northeastern Libya, had built its entire civilization on this one herb for 6 centuries. Every coin Cyrene minted for 300 years carried an image of the plant. And then, sometime around 54 CE, the Emperor Nero was presented with a single stalk. He ate it. That stalk was the last silphium plant on Earth. But the story does not begin in Nero's court. It begins in a document. Around 300 BCE, the Greek botanist Theophrastus set down a fact that most histories glide past. The Cyrenian government had already tried to save silphium. They had set annual harvest limits, dispatched overseers to enforce those limits, and maintained public reserves against years of poor growth. They knew the plant was under pressure. The document survives. The overseers failed. The question this story is really asking is not how silphium vanished, but why every warning was ignored until there was nothing left to warn about. In 631 BCE, a group of Greek colonists from the island of Thera, which we now call Santorini, crossed the Mediterranean and landed on the North African coast. The oracle at Delphi had told them to go. They named their settlement Cyrene, after a freshwater spring nearby. The land sat on a plateau roughly 2,000 feet above sea level, cooled by winds off the sea, backed by desert, edged by limestone cliffs. Remote, difficult, and by the standards of the ancient world, reasonably fertile. But the plant was already there. Silphium grew on the Cyrenian plateau, in a strip of territory roughly 200 miles long and 50 miles wide. It grew nowhere else on Earth. Theophrastus, in his Historia Plantarum, one of the oldest systematic botanical texts to survive from antiquity, documented this exclusivity carefully. The plant required a particular combination of elevated limestone terrain, Mediterranean climate, and coastal air that existed only along this escarpment. Every attempt to transplant or cultivate silphium elsewhere had failed. Roman agronomists tried. Greek traders tried. The plant refused. It would grow on those Libyan hillsides, or it would grow nowhere. Silphium's absolute refusal to grow anywhere else on Earth was the quality that made it worth its weight in silver. It was also the quality that made it impossible to rescue when rescue became necessary. But in 631 BCE, it was just a plant growing on a hillside that the new colonists had not yet learned to value. Within a generation, they had learned. What they had found was unlike anything familiar. The plant rose from a thick, carrot-like root. Its hollow stalk was jointed and ribbed, resembling a giant fennel. Its leaves were fine and feathery. But the most important part was the resin. When the root or stalk was cut, it bled a yellow-orange sap that smelled of something deeply savory, warm, pungent, and slightly bitter. Ancient writers would describe it as richer than garlic, more complex than pepper, something that opened up a dish the way nothing else could. That smell would eventually reach every corner of the Mediterranean world. But before it did, the colonists had to understand what they were sitting on. The Cyrenian state would spend the next 300 years trying to control it. By the 6th century BCE, silphium was Cyrene's primary export. By the 5th century BCE, it was Cyrene's economic purpose. The entire Cyrenian state organized itself around managing this one plant. The fields were state property. Annual harvests were licensed by the government. Overseers monitored the hillsides and kept records of what was cut and what was stored in reserve. Theophrastus describes this administrative apparatus in enough detail that we can reconstruct its broad outlines. Harvest quotas, public reserves against lean seasons, a licensing system for who could cut and how much. The people of Cyrene knew, from an early point in the colony's history, that they were managing a finite resource. They built their government around that knowledge. The wealth that resulted was enormous. Strabo, writing in his geography at the turn of the Common Era, describes Cyrene as one of the most prosperous cities in the ancient Mediterranean world, a peer in trade and culture to Carthage and Alexandria. The city produced the mathematician Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, using 2 sticks and the angle of the sun. It trained Olympic athletes. It built a temple to Apollo that travelers crossed the sea to visit. All of it, in the end, rested on a narrow-leafed herb growing in the hills above the city. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. To understand what Rome eventually destroyed, you need to understand what it was destroying. Silphium was, above everything else, a flavoring agent. Roman writers return to it with a consistency that suggests it was embedded in their cooking the way salt or vinegar was embedded in their cooking. The poet Horace, in his Odes, mentions silphium as a domestic staple, something a prosperous Roman kept at hand as a matter of ordinary household management. Catullus, in Poem 7, makes Cyrene's silphium fields his measure of abundance. Lazar Pisciferus Cyrenus, he writes, the silphium-bearing plains of Cyrene, an image of wealth so familiar to his Roman readers that it required no explanation. The cooking manual attributed to Apicius, compiled in the late Roman period from earlier recipe traditions, lists silphium in dozens of preparations, dissolved in wine, mixed into vinegar-based sauces, crumbled over roasted meats. It was used the way a cook now uses garlic, present in quantity, assumed to be available, fundamental. Silphium was also medicine. Pliny the Elder, in his Naturalis Historia, completed in 77 CE, catalogues it as a treatment for coughs, fevers, sore throats, joint inflammation, and a range of digestive complaints, and also as an antidote to certain poisons. Dioscorides, the Greek physician who compiled his De Materia Medica between roughly 40 and 90 CE, lists overlapping applications with the same note of authority. Both writers are documenting a plant that was already effectively gone by the time they were working. Pliny says explicitly in the Naturalis Historia that silphium had not been found growing in Cyrenaica for many years. He is cataloging something that existed in earlier sources and in living memory. He knows it. He says so. Silphium was also valued as a contraceptive and abortifacient, the resin from its roots used for those purposes. The historian John Riddle, in his 1992 academic study, Contraception and Abortion from the Ancient World to the Renaissance, argues that silphium's contraceptive properties may have been genuinely effective by the medical standards of the time, and that this use, alongside its culinary and medicinal applications, accounts significantly for the extraordinary volume of consumption Rome sustained. Riddle's argument is contested among historians of ancient medicine. What is not contested is that the Romans believed it worked, used it accordingly, and paid accordingly. The Cyrenian government treated silphium as a strategic asset, comparable to bullion. Pliny records that the Roman treasury itself held a stock of silphium at one point, stored alongside gold and silver ingots, classified as a commodity worth protecting from shortage and theft. A pound of resin commanded a pound of silver. For a plant that could not be grown in captivity or transplanted to another climate, that price meant the supply was always and necessarily fixed. The hillsides of Cyrene were not a warehouse the Cyreneans could build out. They were a living system, and living systems have limits. The declining annual yields were a warning. The Cyrenian merchants who controlled the export trade ignored it. This is where the story stops being about wealth. The people who cut silphium from the Cyrenian hillsides, who loaded it onto pack animals and walked it down to the port at Apollonia, who measured it out by the pound under the eyes of state overseers, we do not know their names. None of them. The Roman merchants who purchased the resin at the docks recorded its weight and its price in their account books. They did not record the names of the people who produced it. The Cyrenian government's harvest records, whatever form they took in their day, survive only in fragments cited by writers who were already discussing the plant in the past tense. The harvesters of silphium are invisible in the historical record the way laborers have always been invisible. Their product outlasted them in the ledgers. They themselves did not.
We know something about the conditions of their work. Silphium grew in rocky, elevated terrain. As the more accessible slopes were worked over generations, the plant retreated to steeper ground, further from the roads, harder to reach. The work did not get easier as the years passed. It got harder. And the government's harvest quotas, the limits Theophrastus records as being in place by 300 BCE at the latest, meant that licensed harvesters were working within official ceilings that the Roman market's demand pressed against constantly from outside. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Outside the licensed quota system, contraband silphium moved through the same trade networks at higher prices, with no oversight and no accountability. A harvester working outside the sanctioned system, cutting silphium the overseers had not licensed, could earn significantly more from a few unrecorded loads than from an entire legitimate season. The structure of the trade punished restraint and rewarded extraction. The regulatory apparatus the Cyrenian state had built was always fighting the economics of the situation, and the economics were winning. By the time Theophrastus was writing his Historia Plantarum around 300 BCE, the plant had already been under sustained harvest pressure for at least 2 centuries. What Theophrastus records is therefore not the beginning of a crisis, but the government's reaction to a crisis already underway. The harvest limits, the overseers, the public reserves were emergency measures deployed in response to a collapse already 2 centuries in the making. And emergency measures, applied 200 years into a slow collapse, were not enough to stop what was already in motion. The clock had been running for a long time before anyone recorded that it was running. The herds of livestock grazing on the Cyrenian plateau added a second pressure. Both Theophrastus and Pliny note that sheep and goats would eat silphium when they encountered it. Multiple ancient texts reference the distinctive quality of meat and cheese from animals that had grazed near the plant, which meant the same hillsides where silphium grew were also desirable grazing land. As silphium became rarer, the grazing pressure on whatever remained did not ease. The surviving plant communities, now sparse and concentrated, were if anything more accessible to animals ranging across increasingly bare slopes. Modern research into the historical ecology of the region adds a third variable. Work on climate patterns during the Hellenistic and early Roman periods suggests that the Cyrenian plateau was becoming drier across the centuries of silphium's decline, as the Saharan climate zone advanced northward along the coastal escarpment. The plant was caught between shrinking habitat from the south and intensifying extraction from the north, with no capacity to adapt and no force with the authority or interest to slow what was happening. And somehow, it gets worse. The very system Cyrene had built to manage silphium, its licensing apparatus, its state reserves, its overseers on the hillsides, had made Cyrene's wealth so visible and so reliable that Roman demand grew to levels the regulatory system was never designed to handle. 3 centuries of successful management at moderate demand levels made the resource appear inexhaustible. That appearance was wrong. If this story is worth your time, there is a subscribe button below this video. 1 click keeps more of this coming. By the 1st century CE, silphium had ceased to appear in Cyrenian export records. The market responded the way markets respond to the disappearance of an irreplaceable resource. It found a substitute and declared the substitute adequate. The plant Rome turned to was asafoetida, a resin derived from Ferula asafoetida, a related species native to Persia and Central Asia. Pliny, writing in the Naturalis Historia in the decades immediately after Nero ate the last documented stalk, calls it Median lacer and Parthian lacer, distinguishing the Persian product from the Cyrenian original. His assessment is plain. The substitute is inferior. It is what you use when the genuine article is no longer obtainable. Dioscorides makes the same distinction in the De Materia Medica, with the same note of resignation. Both men were writing after the genuine article had already ceased to exist, and both acknowledged it without apparent surprise. Something had been lost, and what replaced it was an approximation rather than a continuation. Asafoetida, which is still sold and used today in South Asian and Middle Eastern cooking, does carry something of silphium's reported character. It is pungent, sulfurous, and savory in the ways the ancient sources describe silphium being savory. Whether that resemblance reflects genuine botanical similarity between the two plants, or whether Asafoetida simply occupied the same culinary slot in Roman cooking, and therefore acquired the same flavor associations, is a question nobody alive can answer. But the version of this story you have likely encountered is not the full picture. Silphium's extinction is usually described as a consequence of Roman overconsumption. Rome wanted too much, the plant ran out. That account is accurate as far as it goes, but it skips over the mechanism. The destruction of silphium did not emerge from random appetite. It came from the specific intersection of a Mediterranean-scale market that set prices Cyrenian harvesters could not ignore, a property system that gave those harvesters no long-term stake in the plant's survival, a regulatory state that could set quotas but could not override the economics of the contraband trade, and a political relationship between Cyrene and Rome in which Rome's demand, not Cyrene's capacity, set the pace of extraction. People thought they had the full picture. They were wrong. Cyrene was not an equal partner in its own destruction. The city was a supplier to a larger power that generated demand it could not control and had no leverage to slow. The conservation efforts the Cyrenian state made, the regulatory apparatus Theophrastus documents, were genuine. But they were efforts by a city that needed the revenue from the plant to survive, embedded in a trade relationship with a power that had no particular interest in restraint and no reason to develop one. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The disappearance of silphium was a small footnote in Rome's economic history and a foundational collapse in Cyrene's. Rome found the substitute and moved on. Cyrene had nothing left to move to. The city had held its position in the Mediterranean trade network largely because it produced something Rome could obtain nowhere else. Once it no longer held that thing, the leverage evaporated. And if that were the only problem, it might have remained a manageable setback. But the extinction of silphium removed the single economic foundation on which Cyrene's civilization rested, and nothing replaced it. Botanists and historians have spent considerable effort trying to determine what silphium actually was. The most widely supported hypothesis places it within the genus Ferula, the giant fennels, a family of plants native to Central Asia and the Mediterranean basin that includes Asafoetida and several related species. Ancient descriptions suggest a plant with a hollow stalk, feathery leaves, and a resinous root, resembling in broad outline a large fennel. Representations on Cyrenian silver coins, which circulated across the Mediterranean for centuries and showed a consistent image of the plant, have been analyzed repeatedly against known species. Some researchers have proposed that the seed pods depicted on those coins may have inspired the conventional heart shape used in modern iconography, since the pods appear to resemble the familiar symmetrical form. That connection appears in botanical and historical literature and is also disputed. Whether the Cyrenian coin artists were depicting actual seed morphology or using a recognized decorative convention is not something the surviving images resolve on their own. A more recent claim has attracted substantial attention. Researchers including Mahmut Miski, publishing since 2021, have proposed that Ferula drudiana, a plant species growing in mountain regions of Turkey, may be either a surviving variety of silphium or its closest living relative, based on comparisons between the Turkish plant's physical characteristics and ancient coin images. This identification has not yet been definitively confirmed or refuted. If it holds, silphium has been growing quietly in a Turkish mountain valley for 2,000 years, while history assumed it was gone. If it does not hold, the plant is gone in the full sense, and what remains of it is representations on bronze coins and the accounts of writers who were already describing it from memory by the 1st century CE. Either outcome leaves the story of its disappearance unchanged. Here is what that disappearance looked like from Rome's perspective. The plant was expensive, then very expensive,
then available only through connections, then not available at all. The transition from one stage to the next happened across decades, not overnight, which is why no Roman writer marks a specific moment of loss. Pliny simply notes, mid-catalog, that silphium has not been found in Cyrenaica for many years. The world's most valuable herb disappears from the historical record in a subordinate clause. Return for a moment to the harvesters. The people who worked the Cyrenian hillsides left no names in the record. No petition survives in which a harvester asked for relief from impossible quotas. No testimony survives in which anyone described watching the stands of silphium thin out across a working lifetime. The Cyrenian state recorded the quantity harvested and the revenue generated. It did not record what the people doing the harvesting understood or experienced. Their knowledge of the hillsides, the specific locations where silphium still grew healthy, the signs that told an experienced cutter whether a stand was stressed or stable, all of that knowledge was never written down. It died with the people who carried it. We do not know their names. We were never intended to. The pattern this story describes did not end in 54 CE, when Nero ate the last stalk. A single species, confined to one location, generates wealth for the city above it and for the empire trading with it. The city builds a regulatory system to manage the extraction. The regulatory system cannot override the economics it serves. The resource disappears. What remains is a substitute that everyone declares adequate, some accounts by writers who are already speaking in the past tense, and a blank in the record where the people who actually worked the land used to be. Pliny the Elder, who catalogued the known world's resources for the benefit of the Roman state, recorded silphium's disappearance in the Naturalis Historia with the same measured tone he used to describe the properties of pine resin or the uses of beeswax. The plant was gone. The Persian substitute existed. The world continued. What survives of silphium is the shape of an absence. It is in Pliny's past tense. It is in the Cyrenian coins that kept circulating long after the thing they commemorated had ceased to exist. It is in the market logic that still, 2,000 years later, turns irreplaceable biological resources into traded commodities and expresses surprise when they vanish. The harvesters have no memorial. The plant has no grave. What the story leaves behind is a record of how a civilization watched its own foundation disappear and was unable or unwilling to stop it. Silphium was stored in Rome's treasury alongside gold. It flavored the food of emperors. It appeared on the currency of one of the ancient world's great cities for 3 centuries. When Nero ate the last of it, no Roman account marks the moment as significant. It was an unusual gift. The emperor ate it, and the world moved on, as the world does. If this story stayed with you, subscribe below, and leave a comment. When something irreplaceable disappears, who bears the responsibility? If you want to know what happens when a single spice drives an empire to genocide rather than extinction, we already told that story. Tap the nutmeg that wiped out an entire people on the end card right now and keep watching.